Well, I would have been taking my cell phone. I'm remembering this. Like, I was trying to take a picture of it.
The family 30. It's definitely not the NFC East anymore. And you know, could it retain Dan Quinn and moved it up to headquarters? But no, just had to. Yeah, you know.
What did you say?
I don't know. Your first year, quarterback.
As far as hey, I got in governor's opinion.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay. Not that there's a competition.
Oh, yeah.
She also got
That's right.
steel. No,
Yeah, I did that. I think
And his
some guys
his
are
person
meant to be big people.
Plus, there's also a lot of tourists and stuff too that was done. That's so funny. Because all the tourists were left West Maui.
Because
the weather was so bad.
Cardinals.
He said, "Coach, we think it's gonna be fun."
Yeah.
The Thunder Bomb House.
Which actually isn't such a bad thing too.
I'm gonna move your phone.
Yeah.
The Walmart market was full of refugees. Because the Walmart market offered water, hand sanitizer, hand washing machine, and whatever was a super brink. And they allowed people to use the bathroom in the Walmart. No, they brought it in. So, yeah, because the bathroom, so this is the fun part of the story. We done for the Chasing Fires and Keys and Stevens, Central Mountain. And about 6 o'clock, I'm like, where are we gonna go? We stay? Where are we gonna stay? No idea. And so, my wife's talking to me, like, Dave wants to give Chris your number.
Yeah, Cardinals lost the Chiefs.
Oh, and yeah, Chris Pearson, his wife.
God, the worst was so
Chris Pearson was Andrew in Walmart.
Chiefs and Eagles.
So we ended up staying.
I know. I know.
Oh, what on Sunday? This game stinks.
Really?
It was just a weird. I mean, hearing all this praise from Walmart's general manager. I didn't have any idea who he was. He was like a neighbor. It wasn't exactly a crash. He's got a nice house in Walmart.
You're like, I don't figure it out.
Me and the photographer went to have,
Maybe they bring in Blues or 3 to 4
I mean, I don't know. We talked about it. We were talking about it. Come here.
and then we went just like this, like.
Big deal.
And they have so many guests over there. They literally have a luggage room.
Oh my God, it's so funny.
Yeah, politicians.
She worked for Maui, and that was doing also a lot of
And he was a good quarterback.
but that was just a couple of really wacky coincidences like that. So we were going on,
I know, quite a lot.
this was unofficial.
Oh, Jesus.
Ano ai ke aloha ya kākou, mahalo for joining us today. In a moment, it would be my pleasure to bring up Governor Josh Green as he shares more details about his third State of the State address. Governor Green.
Aloha. Thank you for coming. So we were just talking a minute ago about how this is kind of like season 3 of this series. And I know it was very heavy on information and a lot of data, things that we're trying to get done based on what people have asked us to do. And so that's why I wanted to focus on matching up what our greatest challenges are in the state, housing and affordability, with what we are doing each year. And I'm happy to now share many of the backstories, if you'd like, about why it's important to get extra mental health care providers out through the loan program, or why it's important to get the houses built. Because there's definitely a method to the madness. But I'm here for any question you've got.
Our first question comes from Ashley Mizuo, Hawaii Public Radio.
Good morning, Governor.
Good morning.
My question is actually kind of more so along the lines of something that wasn't in your State of the State speech, which is home insurance, which has been, listed as kind of like one of the top priorities this session. Can you talk about, some of the things you expect to see coming out in the legislature in the next couple of months regarding home insurance and what you're working on in that space?
Yes, thank you. So, that in order to not give you a 2-hour speech, which I think probably hopefully was welcomed, I compressed one part of the speech into what the Climate Action Team is doing. So the Climate Action Team has produced a 66-page report, which is pretty dense, actually. That's the project-led Climate Advisory Team, forgive me, that's led by Chris Benjamin and a lot of great thinkers. In that, you can see some of the recommendations that we feel are necessary. So this is what my opinion is that we're going to need on insurance. And let me also preface this by saying I think the issue has been made all the more dire and with immediate need because of what's happening in Los Angeles. I am personally afraid that in the coming 6 to 9 months that property and casualty insurance, the system nationally, could crack because they are going to face hundreds of billions of dollars of extra cost. And if the system itself collapses, states and probably even the nation are going to have to take action. Now, for our state, here are the things I believe are going to happen. We're going to have to take dedicated resources, I believe, from the Hurricane Relief Fund, and we're going to have to dedicate those to allow the state to seed some extra insurance. I think essentially you have to look at it in this way. The state of Hawaii may very well have to provide a layer of protection kind of across the whole challenge, almost like a force field around our industry, so that we have a modicum of insurance for older buildings, for buildings that have to take more time to make their improvements to lower their insurance premiums. We're going to have to likely support some of that. Also, I think that they are going to have to, and the legislature is going to have to pass laws for us, are going to have to give a lot of resource into the overall climate response. And if you read that report, one of the quick highlights says that we are subject to about $500 million of need a year. And that doesn't just magically come from the budget. I think it actually is a resource that has to be created. That's why I just made a brief reference to that's where you will see the questions of climate impact fees, which we've been talking about for 2 years and we need. And you can do it in any number of ways. You can do climate impact fees directly at areas of high use. You can increase the TAT tax and share some of that money with the tourism and hotel industry as they fortify their infrastructure, or you can do what we call the scrape, which is to scrape off the interest of the rainy day fund, which we've maintained at $1.5 billion. It has now creeped up a little bit to $1.56 billion, or $60 million extra from last year. And those resources, if they go into a reinsurance market or into a way to expand and even securitize that money, that means expanding the use of that money by bonding and so on, we can do a lot. If a road is going to collapse on the North Shore, if a series of condominiums need $50 or $75 million of insurance support, we can find that money if it's approved by the legislature. And so I'm glad you asked that. I just didn't feel I could, in that setting, go into this kind of detail on insurance. I will say also, it's not just the insurance question, although that is a huge part of the Maui recovery, but also actually having hard dollars to fortify us for extra roads around towns that might need an escape route, which should lower our insurance premiums. Extra technology, as I mentioned, just a small number of the pieces of technology, which again, if we implement statewide, you then should see insurance folks lower our overall rates. So these are all the things that are in the CAT report, and we have several bills coming out this week, and I would assume the legislature will use that data, which was very well put together, to guide once and for all some kind of positive resolution. I spoke with my team. They asked me, going into third year, like, what do you feel we haven't gotten an achievement or any results on? And it's that. It's, we've had, as you see, there's a lot of points that I made about housing. There's a lot of points I made about homelessness. But on climate impact, it's a new area of policy that hasn't yet found its footing. And I'm very hopeful that the report from this team will bring enough kind of consensus to get this done. We can't go forward as a state without some kind of extra resources for climate adaptation. We have to have it, and Chip Fletcher and others have spoken very eloquently about that.
Question, Audrey McAvoy, Associated Press.
Governor, following up on that, is there not enough money in the current budget to address the climate mitigation needs that the state has?
Let me answer you straightforward. There is enough money in it, but there isn't enough guaranteed money year over year or biennium over biennium. Historically, DLNR and climate has never seen large increases in appropriations. I will tell you my opinion. My opinion is that when we talk to people in society, amazingly, far fewer people focus on that kind of an issue, like the long road ahead on environmental impact, as compared to the immediate things, like getting a school or dealing with homelessness in one's block. And so a lot of times it doesn't gel as a big issue. Now that we've gone through the Maui wildfire, now that we've seen what's happened to Los Angeles, I think people will actually pass, transformative legislation to go forward. So we have it every year in the budget. And the reason I say it should be tied to travel is because it is the impact of having 10 million people come to Hawaii using parks, using roads, degrading some infrastructure that necessitates us to have this money. And the money can come simply from extra fees and income from travelers. That will guarantee that it's matched with the impact year over year. In my opinion, that is a good approach because then there's a direct connection to the many travelers we have, which has made some people, given some people pause about what Hawaii is. We're 1.4 million with an additional 10 million folks that come to Hawaii, which definitely drives our economy forward, but this would guarantee steady money. And as I've said many times, if you capture a small number of people, say half, the adults, that would be 5 million people, you don't have to derive that much money from their travels or their impact to have more than enough to deal with all of these giant climate questions. Also, as you see in Lahaina, people want to come to Lahaina. They want to see it, but we have to rebuild it, and we have to protect it because the land is very dry. We need more water. We need to have more protections against what can come from a wildfire. So it makes sense to me and to the people that I've spoken to have impact fees to help us with that. Then it would be in perpetuity. because someday we will have another recession. May not be this year, might be 3 years from now, maybe as a result of an economic downturn because of much of California has been damaged. But when we do have that downturn, eventually, we won't have the same kind of budget, and that would be the first thing to go. I think we have to focus on climate change and adaptation as a huge part of our going forward policy.
Governor, our next question. Chad Blair, Civil Beat.
Hi, Governor. Thank you. Many governors, including Governor Lingle and David Ige, even well into their second term, would use the State of the State as an opportunity to talk about their vision, to bring up new ideas and proposals to further advance that vision. You essentially recapped the last 2 years. Yes, many accomplishments, but didn't really, that I saw, introduce anything fresh. It also comes in context of a very dramatic development yesterday nationally, which President Trump has introduced all these executive orders, particularly regarding immigration. I'm wondering why you decided to go that route, make no mention of Trump.
Sure. Okay, so that's a very good question. So I kind of thought very hard about what a State of the State speech should be 2 years in after getting elected. And in my opinion, a State of the State speech at 2 years should be a calibration of what the people have actually asked us to focus on, which has been housing and affordability, and to share what we've actually done, and to see where we will go for the next decade. So most, I think, valuable is to see what will happen to people's capacity to stay in Hawaii. That's affordability, biggest issue people will have, which then, of course, housing is a subset of. I think it's very important that we not lose focus. I think people have had enough of aspirational things until they actually get some results. And so I wanted to be able to speak about the housing that we're building, the work we're doing on homelessness, and then just let them know that things like a food security plan, there's an energy plan that will come out in about a week from now, but I wanted to make sure that it didn't distract from the actual results that we're getting. That's why I focused on that speech. Now, if you want to know what my vision is, it's to decrease homelessness by half in our first 4 years and then cut it in half again if I'm given a second 4 years to work on this issue. If you want to know what my vision is for the people of Hawaii, it's everyone can afford a home, which is why I talk about the next decade where we will have 62,000 housing units completed and 46,000 of them will be in the affordable category, so everyone can have a home. So that, I think, is what it comes down to for the people. Now, speaking of the federal government and Mr. Trump, there's just a lot of conflict that's going on, and my focus is on how I can help the people of Hawaii. There are some obvious exceptions. For example, I am spending some energy trying to guide the Senate on whether or not to confirm their HHS secretary nominee, Mr. Kennedy. That's because if he is confirmed, it will affect our public health capacity in Hawaii. It'll affect my ability to keep people healthy and kids especially. And I'm very worried as the only governor that often advises the other governors that we will be in a bad bind as they cut Medicaid. We have 1 out of 3 of our people on Medicaid. So I sometimes lean into what the federal guys do, but I otherwise want to be a partner for our country. I don't want to have a fight just for the sake of having a fight. I want to actually give us some concrete recommendations. And so I'm told that if they have testifiers at Mr. Kennedy's hearings, that I will be asked to come and testify about my experience with him, but I try to stay in my lane. I could chase the bombastic statements that come from the new president day in and day out. I would rather chase housing, homeless solutions, and healthcare providers for our state.
Next, Dan Nicaso, Honolulu Star Advertiser.
Thank you, Makana. Governor, you, in your State of the State, you addressed climate change, or talked about it a great deal, as well as fireworks.
Yes.
Spoke passionately about what happened. You didn't offer any guidance of what kind of legislation for either of those you'd like to see go to your desk. You talked about the scrape. I guess that's a new term we're using now.
Yes.
But it doesn't make up for our financial need for climate change.
Yes.
Do you favor any formula for green fee, tourism impact fee, do you favor any certain kind? I know many kinds of legislation are being proposed about fireworks.
Yes.
Do you favor any model for that? And what are you hearing from both chambers about what ideas are gaining traction on both of those?
Yes. So here are my priorities on climate change and fireworks. I think we have to get to at least $200 million a year raised from impact fees combined with the surplus or the interest from the rainy day fund. If we can get to $200 million, we will have enough monies to fund mitigation projects and support our insurance shortage or the insurance crisis. That's my opinion. Now, the report shows about $500 million a year, which would be the idealized form, and I would love to see that, but we will ultimately find some kind of compromise with the tourism industry and what the legislature feels comfortable doing. I still think that the easiest way to do this is to have a modest increase in the TAT and the monies that come off the rainy day fund, because that's the simplest mechanism. And we can explain very well to the people who are traveling to Hawaii that an extra % of the TAT generates, I think it's about $80 million a year, maybe a little bit more. And the monies that come off the rainy day fund interest are $60 million plus per year. So you could see quickly what you have to do to get there. Also, Senate President has talked very intelligently about having focused impact fees at certain areas that generate money. That works too. But the simplest way, and I think it's probably smart to do things in the simplest way we can to quickly implement it, would be TAT increase, modest, help the hotels deal with loss of beaches, loss of infrastructure that's been going on because of sea level rise, and that extra money off of the rainy day fund. So that's the first policy position. The second policy position is on fireworks. And what I believe we need to do is the following. I think we need to have tickets that we give, that the police department can give out and the law enforcement department can pass out of up to $300. It's a very direct and simple way to collect monies and deter people from putting up very dangerous, large aerials. And you don't need nearly the preponderance of evidence or anything. You can give tickets just like you can give for someone jaywalking or speeding, okay? I think that will cut into it. The second thing I think you have to do is you have to amp the penalties for the accidents or the disasters that harm individuals. And I think those have to be felony offenses where people have significant exposure to jail time. If they shoot off, many large cake fireworks and it causes the tragic injuries like we saw on New Year's Eve, so that people know that that's a felony offense, and if you're going to host one of those events and it goes wrong, you're going to go to jail for sure. And then the final piece on it, just so everyone understands that I support the cultural entertainment part of fireworks, and that is have many more public fireworks shows, and let people even with the assistance of experts have those shows and have magnificent shows, perhaps even from fireworks that they have legally acquired with permits. That people compete to have great shows, but do it in a way that does not expose different communities and people at a block party. And so you do that with those three solutions, and I think you can make things a lot safer. The problem is there are thousands and thousands of individuals that are shooting off these fireworks, and it's going to take a collective will to not do them because there's just more risk. I've shared this a little bit before. Drug use back 40 and 50 years ago was not good or healthy, but it wasn't methamphetamine and fentanyl. And so we've had to change laws significantly because one incident with fentanyl can cause an overdose and take someone's life or their teenager's life. It was not the case 50 years ago when we didn't have that drug. Fireworks was very different 40 or 50 years ago. Yes, there were fireworks. No, there were not explosions of this magnitude, at least to my understanding. And so things change, times change, and that's why these are big issues today. I didn't want to get into those specifics because that could take 10, 15 minutes itself to explain, and I wanted people to see the overarching focus on housing and affordability, with, of course, some additional comments about our healthcare system and people's well-being. Yep.
Next question, Daryl Huff, Hawaii News Now.
Governor, back to the Trump issue. You originally put in your budget plan $10 million to support the Attorney General in challenging Trump, and you've already filed the first of those lawsuits, as I understand.
Yes.
Downstairs, there's a lot of concern about, the last 24 hours he's done a lot of stuff, but he's got Congress that they might target Medicaid. You've already been talking about climate change, energy policy. There's an awful lot of things that could happen.
Yes.
There's a concern that you may need to be prepared this session to backfill some of the stuff that the federal government does. So what is your administration doing to prepare for these eventualities? I mean, do you feel that there is enough money in the budget to deal with, say, a big Medicaid cut? And how do you prepare for something like that?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. So we are prepared. The reason that we left $1 billion of surplus in each of these next 3 years, $1 billion of carryover for the 25 fiscal year, and then 26 and 27 subsequently, is because we anticipate that they may try to cut as much as $300 million out of Medicaid, which then I will humbly ask our team to continue to provide. Because we are a Medicaid expansion state, we believe that people need basic primary health care. Otherwise, they end up with severe illness that's more expensive and more harmful to them. So we will be prepared for that. This actually, this comes back to the AP question also. Why don't you just put, for example, $500 million into climate mitigation? Well, you can. You can find the will maybe out of that $1 billion surplus to fund climate mitigation, but then you quickly reach the floor. Remember, we have to carry $500 million over each year basically to keep our bond rating and keep safe economically. You would then not have the capacity to be nimble in case you deal with the current administration's cuts. We intend to fund drugs for women's reproductive rights, their health, RU 486. We intend to make sure that we have resources for Planned Parenthood if they're cut. We intend to have resources for Medicaid, especially for individuals that have disabilities. We intend to continue to have monies for homeless programs, even if those get cut. And so that's, of course, the consequence of an election, right? Policies end up changing, and we each state cast our votes, but the nation determines who becomes president. And in this case, what is likely to happen at the federal level is significant and deep tax cuts for very wealthy people, and then deep programmatic cuts for poor people, Medicaid. You guys know where I stood on the election, but I will now, as governor, make sure that we have enough resources based on our surpluses to care for the most vulnerable people, and we'll survive. But it also speaks to that earlier strategy, which is as travelers come, and they will continue to come, to have some amount of money generated from the impact of their travels here so that I can handle our climate needs. That's the real description. And a future, if people want a vision, a future of a sustainable state of Hawaii includes fees that come from the large number of travelers, combined with semi-conservative fiscal decisions over the years, which I did, restrict $1.5 billion of spending in case this happened. I always think about what may happen 3 or 5 years out, just in case. And that just in case seems to be coming to fruition.
Next, Stephen Florino, KHON2.
Thank you. Hey, Governor. I believe the only thing you went off script in your State of the State was fireworks. It seems to have affected you, the incident on New Year's really seems to have affected you personally. Can you talk about why and the importance of getting something done this session?
Can I share with you 3 things that have affected me deeply in the last year? A woman was attacked by a person who just left prison, threw acid on this Chinese woman, and she had horrific injuries, millions of dollars of cost, and she's recovering, but it affected her life. Story 1. Story 2, the moment that that person took the lives of his 3 children, his wife, and then himself, I believe in Manoa, when he, I understand, came into some desperate state economically and committed the ultimate crime and tragic moment for us. And then 3, the fireworks display, which critically injured 24 of our people, killing at least 4. So those 3 moments actually shaped what my approach to governing is and the budget. And let me explain why, okay? Why are we doing the loan forgiveness program help? Because if we do that, then we have a lot more social workers, psychologists, and psychiatrists available, possibly, to help someone who's coming out of jail and doesn't therefore commit a terrible crime against an individual, or that family of 5 maybe is here today if we had a psychiatrist that they could have seen, someone safe to talk to. That's one story, okay? So that's the policy. The policy, as boring as it is to do loan forgiveness for healthcare providers, will provide those providers so that these tragedies don't occur, we hope. Second story, why was that family in such dire straits? Because it is too expensive to live in Hawaii, and he was a professional who felt he still couldn't afford his home. His taxes were too high. The property costs are too high. So you hear me talk in pretty straightforward terms about a tax break of $5.6 billion. That is to prevent families from getting so desperate. That's why we do that and why we're building housing, because the more housing we build, the costs should plateau or come way down if we actually succeed in building the 62,000 houses over the next 10 years. That helps that family. And then the third reason I spoke about the tragedy on New Year's Eve, it was obviously a direct, causality. Reckless behavior by just a few, because we've let it get out of control for decades, caused mayhem for innocent souls. And that's the most easy one for people to understand. It's this terrible thing happened, maybe direct action will stop it. So underlying all of these policies that appear very wonkish, and there are a lot of numbers behind them, are these tragedies that a governor hears or sees. And that's why I'm here, which is to try to have strong systemic corrections or support for solutions that you may never hear. The goal is to never hear about a father taking the lives of his children because he was desperate economically. The goal is to never imagine a mass shooting because kids got counseling at school and maybe a psychologist and we had a gun buyback. And maybe in 2026 we'll have no loss of life because people go to public fireworks shows and they take a pause on buying them. So that's how I go about things. And needless to say, for years I've been interested in the homeless issue because I saw it as an emergency room doc. I try not to go off script because it's incumbent upon me to actually get some of these results. It's not for a television program to see it on the screen. It's for actual results to change things for the better here and make them safer so that people can have the great moments. And I wish I could restore the great moments for the people that were injured in the fireworks disaster. I wish I could restore and go back in time and have more psychologists already for that father who must have been so desperate and did terrible things. That's how I approach it.
Mahalo, Governor. Finally, Paul Drews, KITV4.
You mentioned homeless, and I know you talked about the kauhales for those who are willing and able to go into those for more housing. Also, the state hospital being able to provide some more resources for mental health. Does more need to be done to get those chronically homeless off the streets that are resistant to going into shelters, kauhales, that do have, say, mental issues and don't want the help or the resources but are still out there?
Yeah, they do. And so, again, in this case, one of the success stories we've been having has been with Mayor Blangiardi, Dr. Island, and Dr. Miskovich, who have been running the kind of the advanced kauhales down in Iwilei, where they have 62 beds for people that are often deeply troubled and their mental health is compromised, but they're able to get people hospital-level care in a Cal Poly setting. And what we're doing is we're peeling back layer after layer after layer of the homeless challenge. The first and more easy part of the challenge is to just get people who are wrestling with poverty and find, transitional housing and then permanent housing for them. We're already really deep into the part where people have had addiction or who have been on the street for so long that their PTSD has incapacitated them. Those are the ones that will probably need community treatment, which we have the laws on the books where if they are a danger to themselves or others or have decompensated, that they can be mandated into some level of care. And ultimately, it'll be up to them whether they stay, but we're going to have to force people sometimes into housing, because once they get stabilized with their mental health, they can fly. They can rejoin their families. They can stay in a village. So we've seen a lot of that. This year, we're going to focus our Cal Polys on a couple groups, youth that have been displaced, extraordinary work that Carla does at RISE and that's been advocated by some people that are dear to us. Kupuna, a lot of our kupuna, and forgive me, because a kupuna is on the street is someone who might only be 60 years old or 65 years old because they've aged 20 or 30 years on the street and they, are really debilitated. We want to help those individuals because they often need health care. We've been taking care of a bunch of people that have had cancer, but they can, once they have a tiny home, they can stabilize and get health care. Those are groups that are important. But at the end of the day, the process to have Cal Poly statewide is so that every community doesn't have too many programs which they might feel sensitive about, but enough spread out across the state so that each community has contributed somewhat to the solution. And that's the beauty of moving towards 30, where you see them all across the state, 40 beds here, 30 beds there, 60 here, expand the state hospital a little bit. That's called the social health system, a phrase that I've been using. And that social health system deals with both poverty, mental illness, and then the actual housing instability. And so we can do it. And actually, the interesting part is we save money on our Medicaid budget, which comes right back to the beginning, where when the question was asked, what are you going to do from Darrell if the federal government cuts hundreds of millions of dollars? Well, we can do things better because, as you heard in my speech, the cost of a person normally is about $8,000 a month if they're on the street for health care. It drops to just under $2,000 if they have a roof over their head. And that is a lot of savings when you start multiplying that by 1,000 people, 2,000 people. So, I spend a lot more time on like health philosophy and those kind of programs behind that door over there day to day. When I come out to give a speech to the public, I just try to tell them what we're doing and ask them what they'd like me to work on going forward. I will work out the details and get input from experts as we go.
Question from Ashley Mizuo, Hawaii Public Radio.
Sorry, going back to the scraping the rainy day fund.
Yes.
Quick question. Does that require 2/3 majority in the House and the Senate?
I think it would, actually. I thought about that. So the question is, if you affect the rainy day fund, if you take anything from it, in fairness, it, I think, is a change that requires 2/3. And so I think we would want 2/3. If the idea is good enough, I don't think we have a problem getting 2/3 of the votes. I just think the question is, are we going to be committed to, taking enough resources, whether it's impact fees or a TAT or the rainy day fund, to actually be serious about addressing climate change. The first things we did, though, we put right in the budget the nuts and bolts of the fire marshal, some of the fire breaks, the sensors, those kind of things. Look, everyone knows that we would be insane to not prevent the next fire. And thank goodness this last season was much more mellow. But I was telling everybody it was coming. I didn't know it was going to be California and Los Angeles. It is going to happen in community after community after community across the globe if we don't do a lot more on fire mitigation and climate change, a lot more. And I think you're going to see this be one of the signature approaches to generate monies in budgets, especially for tourist areas. That's going to definitely happen. So I'm happy to help. I've been sharing with Governor of California and several of the Western governors how we can legislate new solutions that we're working on, and even mitigate some of the challenges they'll have after their disaster, which is probably 10 times bigger than the Lahaina fire. So there's a lot to do, and I hope everyone sees that we're trying to work on all these issues. There's other things that we will talk about in the coming weeks and months, I'm sure. For instance, no one has asked me about Child Protective Services. We're very passionate about that. We want to add extra resources and extra guidance before anyone ever files a federal injunction against us. So we've begun to work on that. That means support for Ryan Yamane and his team. It's very hard because salaries are low for social workers, and Child Protective Service work is extraordinarily hard, as is foster care. So we intend to provide extra resources there if we can, contain federal cuts. There's other issues that we, like I touched briefly on food security. We intend to move towards free lunches for the entire state, for all kids in schools. But first we have to fix some of the statute a little bit, because if people are familiar, the statute requires that kids pay at least half of the cost of lunch. The cost on paper of lunch is $9 a lunch, which means they'd have to pay $4.50. That would be an increase in cost. We're not going to do that. We're going to change the statute so it's only a quarter must be covered as we move into a 5-year plan to cover the cost, which will cost tens of millions of dollars, but it's good for our keiki. It's just there's so many issues, and we happen to have become a wartime governorship because of the fire and the disaster that we experienced. So it does occupy a lot of our necessary bandwidth. But all these issues are just as important as one another. It's just I don't want to subject people to a 3-hour State of the State speech. I'm thinking about Chad mostly when I avoid that. Yeah.
Governor, one final question. Paul Drews, KITV4.
You were talking about the fires and also the need for the state to create fire breaks around homes. LA has a thing where if homeowners can be fined if they don't do that. Is that what you're talking about here, putting it back on homeowners, that it's their responsibility?
Not necessarily putting it fully on homeowners, but providing resources to have fire breaks around communities is one. And our Department of Transportation has been tasked to do that, and Ed Sniffen is excellent. He is a real go-getter, and I'm appreciative of his work. So that's our current proposal. Now, it may ultimately be true that for each individual house, we make statutory changes about how much area you have to spread around a home or a subdivision, because no one's going to insure them otherwise, and we want to be supportive of them to keep the value of their properties and to be safe both. We will see what ultimately the legislature gives us from a statutory recommendation, but the smartest thing to do is to retrofit houses right now with better roofs and fire protection. You notice that only 2 of the homes in Department of Hawaiian Homeland in Lahaina burned out of, I think, 133 or 136, even though they were subjected to the same embers that the rest of Lahaina was. And that was because they were newer and they had some of the technology in place and they didn't burn. They also had some space around each of the homes because they were single-family homes for the most part. And so there are some good decisions we can make. I know this is going to sound a little bit next level, but I've even begun to work with some fire experts on some containment system on embers, just of my own capacity. After seeing what we saw, some abilities to catch embers in kind of broad strokes where there are red flag warnings. One of the interesting parts about being a governor is you see the actual landscape of these disasters, and I think that there could be some technologies that could be deployed in certain parts of the country where there is higher risk. So I'm having conversations with them about that. And look, you have to do everything in order to prevent fires now because of what climate change has done. And I know that will generate a few social media posts about climate change not existing. It does. Let's try to protect our people and do it with actual solutions. So that's how we're approaching it. I think you're going to see meaningful laws passed on insurance and fire prevention this year. I know that the chairs are very thoughtful about this, and enough time has passed to incubate these ideas. It's been 15 months, so they will likely pass really serious laws on insurance this year. Okay, well, so anyway, I guess that's it, but thank you for the questions, okay? I knew I'd have this opportunity to break down some of these policy issues with you. Expect us to stay focused, though, okay? For decades, we were talking about the housing crisis, and we didn't really make enough progress on it. You're going to hear me talk about housing and homelessness again next year. I will give you a little mini warning, because it doesn't just get fixed in 1 or 2 years. But, you know, over 4 or a few more years, you will see massive changes for the better. And I want this generation of kids to be able to come back and live in Hawaii affordably. And that's why so much time and focus is on tax breaks, housing, and homeless care. And along the way, we'll bring in a few extra doctors and nurses to care for our people. Thank you, guys. Aloha. You bet.
Formally concludes today's news conference.